All right. Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Murshak. With me today is Cody Moser. Cody is a good friend of mine, as well as a PhD student in the Department of Cognitive and Information Sciences at UC Merced. And his work primarily focuses on evolution of human behavior and human institutions. Cody, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be back on. I think last time we chatted, we were in the middle of lockdowns, so that was pretty fun.
Yeah. And you were on my last show actually quite a few times. You're one of the sort of guests that came back more than once, and we've always had really great conversations together. So I'm excited to sort of see what we're going to get into this time, and also to see, that you seem to have really, gotten your foothold in the work that you're doing over at Merced. So I wanted to just take the opportunity today to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the research you've been working on and your areas of interest. So let's just start in giving people a better idea about what it is you study and sort of your theoretical approach to the study of cultural evolution and institutions.
Yeah, sure. So for those who aren't familiar with kind of my background, I used to be an anthropologist, specifically a primatologist. So I would go into the field and follow around primates, write down what they were doing, do experimental manipulations with lemurs and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun. But I realized kind of halfway through a PhD program that I was more interested in some broad scale patterns about human social systems. That I was interested, say, in the origins of complex societies, how we got all the amazing things that we have now, like the computer that we're talking over, and the internet, which funnels all the data. And I was exposed to some formal methods in modeling that seem to be developing in this field of cultural evolution. Specifically, a lot of people were using different kinds of network methods and agent-based models to look at real-world systems, but also to try and model what they think is happening in these systems. So it was kind of a way for me, in looking at these methods, a way of kind of being a theorist, but doing so without just sitting in your armchair and just thinking things up. Now you can actually have kind of a testing ground for your theories in the form of formal models. These models often take the form of, say, mathematical models or agent-based models, which I primarily use. And basically all an agent-based model is you're creating a little world that has a number of logical preconditions, having agents interact in that world with a certain set of rules, and then just seeing what ends up happening. And so it's a way to take all the different parts of a theory, break it down, and see what that actually produces in, say, a group of simulated people. So that, so that's kind of what I work on now. My primary research questions are have to do a lot with organizations and institutions. I like to say I do organizational life history, meaning how do they arise? How do they become optimized in their environments? And then ultimately, how do they collapse? Because, very few things exist forever. And so we're kind of at a point where we're producing formal models of these to try and understand how, groups of people come together and do things.
So in a way, you see the lifespan of an organization as analogous, or maybe even identical to that of individual organisms, and there is a sort of similar, I guess, evolutionary ecology to the way that organizations function. Would that be fair to say?
You almost could say that, yeah. Obviously there's competition between organizations in their niches. These things tend to persist way past any one individual human's lifespan. And a lot of these institutions create rules that ensure their survival. Certain norms arise that make the institution strong against external influence, or allow it to propagate further and further. And these different institutional arrangements are essentially walking around on fitness landscapes,
Mhm.
just like, any other human is doing. But of course, there are some differences in terms of this kind of teleological view. What is an organization doing? Well, it's presumably doing what its founders try and guide it towards doing. But the thing,
Presumably.
presumably, yeah. But the thing is that a lot of these things have mission creep. They stay around for a lot longer than necessarily they need to. And so there's a sense in which these things are exhibiting their own almost agency in the world.
Yeah, I mean that is interesting. Lots of people have talked before about obviously organizations that sort of um live sort of beyond their initial mission or impetus for being, and then sort of become corrupt in some kind of way or very
Mm-hmm.
perverse. And I guess one of the ways of thinking about that is that there are kind of natural limits on um, the lifespan of, let's say, a human body that's literally become corrupt or is like break in the process of breaking down. And there are ways in which organizations, maybe even humans too, can sort of prolong the process of
Mm-hmm.
deterioration by sort of making all these bad trades. It's interesting to think about the analogy, like how far we could stretch it. Like there's a way in which these organizations sort of accumulate mutational load and various kinds of
Mm-hmm.
debt and other things like that. And there's also a way in which, I mean, people don't like to talk about this much these days because a lot of what we call the life sciences now is being rebranded as kind of life extension in many ways.
Yeah.
But that field also has this strange dynamic of wanting to, it seems sometimes, prolong life at any cost.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something very perverse about that at a certain level. And so that's just something that comes to mind when I think about an institution that outlives its core mission.
Yeah.
Maybe humans have the same problem to some extent. If we can find the means to do so, maybe there is just a kind of maybe life is better if we just accept, that we will expire at some point. I'm not sure. That's a more philosophical question that maybe we could think about. But so I wanted to get a little bit back into kind of the methodologies that you're using. So you mentioned agent-based modeling,
Mm-hmm.
and this sort of seems to be the primary method for at least running a lot of these simulations that you're doing to kind of test these different hypotheses that you might have. And um, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the ways in which you're doing this agent-based modeling and some of the uh I guess some of the conclusions that you can draw from doing this kind of work,
Mm-hmm.
because to an extent it is a it's necessary in order to have something that's amenable to scientific study, that you simplify the models, right? And so there's always this question that, like, if you have this very highly simplified model of the world, to what extent is it actually mapping onto reality? So could you talk us through like just a basic example of how one of your models, or maybe one of the models that you've worked on recently,
Mm-hmm.
uh, can give us useful insights about how organisms or how systems evolve?
Yeah, sure. So actually a good model to talk about uh, might not be mine, but might actually be Thomas Schelling's. Are you familiar with the Schelling model?
No, please tell
So
us.
so the Schelling model is kind of one of the most classical in terms of agent-based models. So Schelling, when he was on a plane, came up with a model because he had something like a roll of quarters and a roll of pennies in his pocket. And so using a napkin and these quarters and pennies, he just said, "Oh, you know what? I think this is how this works," and kind of played the model out on the airplane before he actually ever wrote it up. And so basically what this model shows is this. all of the agents, let's assume that there's two groups of agents. Group one has a preference for group one, group two has a preference for being by group two. And this preference is just ever so slight. So it's like, I like being around, say, my blue members, like, 5% more than I like being around the red members, which means that if I'm around the red members, I'm not totally dissatisfied, but I would rather be around the blue members. And so he wrote the model so that at each time step, each iteration in the model, these agents, which were placed on a grid, could move closer towards the individuals that they preferred to be by. And so time step one rolls, the blue guys say, okay, well, just to kind of satisfy myself a little bit more, I'm going to move closer to a blue. And a red will say, okay, just to satisfy myself a little bit more, I'm going to move closer to a red. And what he found is that with this kind of extreme micro bias, there's a very slight bias. What you end up with is like large scale segregation in terms of the spatial arrangements of these groups. You essentially end up with these, rivers of red, these rivers of blue. They're hardly interacting with one another. And he said it's called the Schelling segregation model, because for him, it's a model of segregation. Now, of course, if you think about what causes segregation, it's way more complex than that. There's like house prices, there's the ability to actually move. Ostensibly, there's some kind of racism that's explicit. But the point is what he was trying to show is that these micro biases can produce macro behavior. So it was not necessarily a model of the real world, but what it was a model of something that happens in the real world and how it can produce some dynamic on an exaggerated level, if that's all that's acting. And so that's the way that I see a lot of these simplified models, is that I'm showing you a very coarse-grained picture of what might be happening in real life. So for example, I have a paper that I'll be presenting next week in London on these core-periphery dynamics in innovation.
Yes.
And yeah. So this is a really fun model. My buddy Jesse Millsman did most of the work in coding it up, but it's based on another model of innovation that I had done previously called the potions task. And in this potions task, oh, there's a bug. Sorry. And in this potions task, basically everyone starts with a set of 6 ingredients. They have 6 potions. And what they can do is they can work with someone that they're connected to in their network to combine ingredients. Sometimes these combinations yield new inventions, sometimes they don't. But when they get a new invention, they then add that to their inventory and they can use that to combine even more ingredients.
Okay,
now there's a bias.
Hold on. That recombination counts as like a sort of innovation score, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's a score. Each time they get a new item, it has a higher score. And in this case, the agents are biased towards using this higher score. It's this kind of novelty bias. I get something new and I tend to use it. And it's based off of this experiment where people really did do this. As they discovered new things, they forgot that they could go back and use some of their older things and find different combinations. So what ends up happening is that in a group where people are all talking to each other, they tend to get stuck. There's 2 trajectories of potions. One in which, if you make an initial set of ingredient combinations at the beginning, you'll tend to discover, or randomly you'll discover the other one. But because you don't go back and combine that original set, you don't find the other trajectory. And so in a group of people where everyone is talking to each other, they tend to get stuck on one trajectory or the other. And the reason for that is consensus. Consensus is pretty bad for models of innovation. You need some outlier people who are able to kind of buck the trend and not agree with everyone. Because if you're all doing the same thing, then you can't really find novelty. And so in the course of doing a prior model, I found these nodes in some of the networks who were, kind of on the periphery. They weren't doing much. I called them loser nodes because they weren't really interacting with anyone. Their payoffs were horrible. Like if you're kind of watching the simulation, you're just thinking the whole network would be better off without them and the average would rise without them. But what you find is that when the network gets stuck, when it's at this point, when it doesn't know what else to do, these loser nodes are very important because they have a memory of the system's prior states. They're not thinking with everyone else.
Hmm.
So what we did was we produced these kind of core periphery networks, ones in which you have this tightly clustered core, which has a lot of consensus, combined with this periphery that's not really connected to itself, and it's certainly not really that connected to the core. And what happens is this periphery is able to explore new options. It can send the information to the core, which can then exploit these options, do whatever it needs to with them. And in the
Hmm.
meantime, the information doesn't travel back outwards to the periphery. And so these are just perpetual loser nodes. They're people who are, sitting in their ivory tower, not doing anything with the information. But then when the information goes to the core, it gets used immediately. And so this kind of model, represents a lot of what we see in economics, in the economics of innovation specifically, where innovators tend to come from the outside. Someone who has a different eye on something suddenly becomes, the most important guy in the world.
So these would
Uh,
be like Nassim Taleb's tinkerers.
Right, exactly. And there's even some people who have explicitly tried to capture this dynamic. This is what Lockheed's Skunk Works is. It's a group that's basically separated from the rest of Lockheed. The innovations come from Skunk Works back in, but they don't go back out. Steve Jobs did this with the Mac division in Apple. He realized that they weren't being very innovative. They weren't getting much done. And so basically he separated their offices physically and cut them off from the rest of Apple, so that they could go work on something from the outside, and then they could pull that information back into Apple's core, but without exposing them to what the other project teams were doing.
Okay. All right. So I'm just gonna have you stop there so that we can do a rough so that we can outline sort of like where we're at. And there's a few directions that I imagine we can take this discussion. I really wanted to go in depth on this core periphery dynamic because I think it's a very important piece of work that you're doing. It's also very relevant to this conference that you'll be attending. So you have you have basically a network that's broadly split into two groups, which
Mhm.
is the core and this periphery, right? And on the core, you have a tightly connected group of nodes that are all talking to each other. And then on this periphery, you have a very disparate, loosely connected group of nodes who may or may not be talking to each other,
Yep.
and some of whom are tightly or less tightly connected back to the core. That's the basic model. And what you're saying is going on is that whenever the core is basically not learning enough new stuff, it's not innovating fast enough, it has to absorb new innovations from the nodes that are out exploring different kinds of territory in the periphery. And that because the periphery is only loosely is in some cases only loosely connected to the core, the peripheral nodes have a different kind of memory of the
Hmm.
system as a whole, right? It
Yeah.
maybe even like a spotty memory that's like missing some things, and that this is useful in innovation space because there's this explore versus exploit dynamic. And you're saying that the existing system was leaning too far in the exploit category, and it was basically just trying to, iterate on previous gains in knowledge instead of
Yeah.
actually trying to find new stuff. And this periphery is actually essential for finding new stuff, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Um,
Okay.
yeah,
And
we
then
can
any
kind of
other
go into,
elaborations? I have a few more one more thing to bring up and then
yeah, sure.
but you can elaborate on that if I was incorrect or there's anything else you
No, no,
wanted to
no, no.
add.
That was totally right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. And my understanding of the paper that you recently published, which let me find the paper. It's called Decentralized Core Periphery Structure and Social Networks Accelerates Cultural Innovation in Agent-Based Modeling. This is published with yourself and your partner, well, not partner, but co-author Jesse Millsman. Um, and what you did was you identified basically three broad models for how these actual networks could be, let's say, shaped, correct? So one is the affinity model,
Hmm.
where there's heavy intra-block connectivity. And by this, you meant that the core nodes are all very highly connected to one another, and the affinity nodes are all very highly connected to one another.
Hmm.
Um, there's also the centralized model, which fits a lot of sort of how many organizations are structured currently, which is that there's dense core connectivity and also dense connectivity of the core periphery. I'm sorry, of the core to the periphery nodes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's the final model, which is the decentralized one, which is the one we're going to talk about here, which is dense core connectivity. So all three of these have dense core connectivity. But there's sparse connectivity on the periphery and elsewhere. Is that
Yeah.
right? So those are the three general shapes um, in which this network or pair of networks can take. And what was interesting about this research that you did was that you discovered that one of these shapes tends to be better at innovating than the other two. So let's get into that.
Yeah. So out of all those, the best one is the decentralized core periphery. And this is just a system where the periphery is not only isolated from themselves, but also isolated from the core. That's not to say that the affinity groups are bad. So the affinity group is what you might call in, say, a lot of network science, a more modular system. So these systems kind of are not really attached to each other. They're off doing their own things. But these modular systems are also very good. So in a previous paper, or actually it's a preprint, but in previous work, we created a graph called the connected caveman graph. And the connected caveman graph is one where you have these units that are fully connected to each other. What you do is you sever one of the ties within the units, and then you add them to one of the other units. And so what that is, you get this like string of clicks that are all kind of talking to each other. And this one does extraordinarily well at the task. And the reason is because it's able to subdivide the parts of the task that it's required of. In some sense, I wonder if what the decentralized core periphery is doing is something similar, where it's subdividing the tasks, but in such a way that each task might be like one node. Um, but that system does quite well. And earlier you mentioned the explore exploit trade-off. So this is something that a lot of people talk about in organizational theory and just cognitive science of behavior. In terms of individual decision making. And what this trade-off kind of represents is, okay, I have to do something. I have to make some decision, and then I have to act on it. I have two alternatives. One, I can start acting now, given the information that I have, or two, I could explore a little bit and look around and gather more information and then act. And it's a tricky thing for a lot of real world institutions trying to balance this dynamic. I call it, trying to have your cake and eat it too. How is it that you're able to explore and exploit at the same time? You see a
Mm,
lot of times in real world organizations, we'll talk about the startup world real quick,
sure.
where founders will start flat, meaning that
Mm,
everyone in the organization kind of talks to each other. There are no formal rules. Everyone's on the same level. There's no hierarchy. And what this allows, it allows the organization to do a lot of search. It gives each individual member a lot of lateral movement so that they can figure out what their role is going to be, what it needs to be. It allows the organization to respond quickly to novel problems that come up in its environment. But the problem is that once a startup finds exactly the problem that it's going to be working on, it often needs to start exploiting. And what it does is it switches to a hierarchical system. And this is actually a very dangerous state for organizations to be in, because all of a sudden you had all these people that were friends, they were buddies and colleagues, and suddenly now they're bosses and employees. And you see this happen all the time, these kind of flat to hierarchical transitions just ending in failure. And also vice versa. It's happened the other way, where organizations started hierarchical, tried to go flat, and then it lost a bunch of people. But so what this kind of decentralized core periphery model is it's allowing this group of agents to have their cake and eat it too. Because the agents on the external, on the periphery, aren't receiving information from the core, but it's just going straight to the core. they're able to continue exploring while the core is able to take any new information and immediately use it as quickly as possible.
Okay. So, and this is related to kind of the efficiency of information within the network, the
Yeah.
way in which information propagates between the nodes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, what you're kind of saying is that to get optimal levels of innovation, you actually need to have some inefficiency in terms of the information flow built into the network. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So my advisor and I and a few other people in the lab just published a paper. It just got accepted called Transient Diversity is a Principle for Collective Problem Solving. And
Okay. And
basically what
what
we
do you mean by
found,
that?
yeah, sure. So transient diversity um, comes from the philosophy of science. And basically what the statement means is it's a population's ability to entertain multiple theories. And
Mhm.
so let's say that there is a theory about how, I don't know, clouds form tornadoes, right? Um, if there's really only one theory and everyone's working on that theory, there's not that much transient diversity. But if there are multiple theories and people are working on these different theories, there's a lot more transient diversity. Um, and so we say that this is a general principle for problem solving because across a wide range of models, not just this, bespoke potions task, but across more popular things in complex systems such as the NK landscape, which is basically this task made by Stuart Kauffman in 1989, where you can make rugged adapted landscapes computationally tractable. The Hong Page model, all these different models basically came to the same conclusion, which is that less efficient information sharing is actually better for collective problem solving. And you can increase this transient diversity in several ways. You can make the network sparser. You can literally slow down the rate of interactions between people. You can introduce some outgroup bias. So this idea that I'm not going to believe something coming from the red team and the blue team's not going to believe what's coming from me actually might have some benefits in an epistemic system.
Mhm.
But basically, all these different principles lead to improvements in collective problem solving. And it all boils down to the network or the group of people being less efficient at their jobs.
Wow. And so that's a little bit of an unintuitive finding, I would think, for most people. Um, One of the other things that I noticed in reviewing some of your work on this and some of the other work that you referenced is that there are also trade-offs between these different models in terms of the simplicity and complexity of the problem that you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
solve. So the more hierarchical structures actually do work very well
Yep.
for solving very simple problems. But the more complex a problem is, the more you need sort of um, these, I guess what you would term as like parallel exploration or different kinds of inefficiency or
Yeah.
even redundancy, um, in order to sort of work on these complex problems. And it just, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on like the relationship between um, uh these like structures and complex problems? Is it really just an uh do you think it really just comes down to like information flow and questions of like epistemology, or is there something going on? um Obviously, if it's turning up in these agent based models, it's not simply a matter of human psychology. It's
Mm-hmm.
not some sort of quirk of us as beings, and so it seems to be more fundamental than that. And that it really is about these structures, and these structures have an effect on um, getting through getting through complex problems.
Mm-hmm.
What are the implications that you see more broadly for large organizations? You said that this is useful to think about in terms of collective problem solving. It seems that there would be implications not only in academia, obviously areas directly concerned with epistemology, but also areas such as governance.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned startups as well. All of these different kinds of large collective human activities that we have would benefit potentially from knowing about how these different models interact depending on what kind of problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah, this is a really good point. So the question is kind of, you know, is this real? What is it capturing beyond these bespoke interactions of the agents, and what does it apply to? And this is a great question because it gets kind of into the heart of what I've been working on lately. Recently, I was part of a large paper titled "All Intelligence is Collective Intelligence." And basically, the perspective that we took is that any intelligent system, meaning a system that has to, make decisions in a changing environment, is being driven by the same dynamics. We might call these complex adaptive systems. You could also call them generative adaptive systems, which is the approach I take because it implies that they're also generating novelty when they're solving problems. And these principles keep popping up pretty much everywhere. It seems that in any learning system or any adaptive system, you're going to come across some of these same things. So, for example, Douglas Hofstadter, in talking about just general computation, he talks about this parallel terraced search, which is, again, this ability for the population to do some parallel processing of its problems. And in that case, he's talking about, optimizing AI for thinking about things. We can think about it in terms of groups of people and how we could structure our institutions. You can think about it in biological populations. So something that I've discovered recently is that while all these models seem different from each other, they really all descend from pretty much the same model, which is Wright's shifting balance theory, where he came up with this idea of adaptive landscapes having peaks and valleys. The agents kind of scramble to get to the peaks. And then the question is, well, how do they get to an even higher peak? And so,
Right.
he had all these questions about what is the process of adaptation. You see it in gradient descent. Gradient descent is obviously one of the most used in machine learning now, but
It's the same thing. It's the same thing.
and it literally is the same thing because when gradient descent was finally formalized by Haskell Curry in 1944, the keynote speaker at the American Mathematical Society the year before was Sewell Wright, where he was talking about agents ascending and descending gradients in an adaptive process. And so if you just think, okay, what does a system which is trying to learn or trying to survive in the face of uncertainty or novel information have to do? Well, it has to have some memory. And so this is pretty much your ability to exploit. But it also has to be looking out for what's coming on the horizon. And that's your ability to explore. And so you just see this across a range of systems, including in human brains. So we see in the human brain, there's been a lot of people concentrating on modular systems as arising for solving tasks. So I might have a module for dealing with taking in visual information out of the world. I might have a module for motivating the hunger system, et cetera, et cetera. But lately, something people have been concentrating on is the presence of these core-periphery systems in learning. So, for example, there's a question of why do we have the hippocampus when the brain can also learn without it? Well, it seems that the hippocampus allows you to learn things much faster, while as there's slower learning happening throughout the whole system. We see during periods of skill learning, a sort of core peripheryness being captured that seems to improve as you learn a skill, which that's basically like, let's say you're learning to play the piano, right? You develop what's called a core competency, which is just your ability to play the piano in general. But as you want to learn new skills, you don't want to have to go back and relearn the certain ways that you're learning the piano. You don't want to have to delete information in order to move forward into more complex tasks. So what you do is you kind of have two systems. You have one that knows what it's doing, and then you have one that's a little bit more experimental.
So the brain is a microcosm in a way of this larger dynamic.
Yeah.
And people forget that the brain itself is just is a network of nodes. and there's pruning and all kinds of other stuff going on where it's just getting better at solving whatever complex task. I mean, as far as we know, the brain is the most general problem solver that we have.
Yeah.
So at least for now. um so that's like important to just keep in mind. It's pretty crazy when you think about uh all the levels at which these principles are operating,
Hmm.
from a single, like from within a single human mind, all the way up to these massive, large scale, million person organizations.
Yeah.
The principles are basically the same. um I don't know if there's like something going on too with slime molds that maybe is very similar, but I wouldn't be surprised that at even lower levels of network complexity, similar principles are operating.
Hmm. Totally.
So, with that being said, um, I forget where we were. So you were mentioning that the human brain also operates in these ways, and we were talking about how different systems could incorporate this knowledge. Do you think that on an individual level, it's also like that there's something, I mean, there's something to be gained just from an individual understanding this dynamic, not
Mm.
only in terms of their contribution, let's say, to an existing organization, or an existing field of study that they might be involved with, but also to their own, explore and exploit dynamics in terms
Yeah.
of assessing their own, general problems. Because life is complicated, maybe even complex, and so uh people have to be thinking about these. And this is one of
Hmm.
the things that, I mean, I've at least, since learning about the exploit explore dynamic, many years ago, it's a pattern that I just see showing up over and over and over again, in my life and in others. People always have questions, should I go study this thing? Should I go to this job? Should I move to this city, etc.? And all these questions, in some ways,
Yeah.
um, break down into just understanding, okay, what it is are you trying to do right now? Are you trying to take advantage of something that you already have set up that's good and that's working, or are you stuck somewhere, and are you ready to delve down into the valley, so to speak, and
Hmm.
go to try to find something new?
Hmm.
Do you find it's useful for thinking about just direct personal problems?
Yeah, of course. Because what all these adaptive systems are trying to do is they're trying to hedge against uncertainty. And that's, if the world was so certain, we wouldn't have so many problems, right? Like we wouldn't have
Hmm.
anxieties. We wouldn't necessarily have, be frozen by our own decision-making processes. We would just do exactly whatever had the highest payoff. But unfortunately, uncertainty rules the world, and we can't really predict the future so well. Yeah, I definitely think about it with myself. I mean, I tend to think very much on the group level. So, where's it that maybe I sit in terms of my group's dynamic, and how is it that I can encourage this group to be more like the ideal systems maybe captured in the models. Of course, there's so many human complexities that maybe that'll be a damning thing for me in the future. I don't know. Um, but yeah,
I saw that you made a collaboration network for your own department.
yeah.
I was just curious when I saw that. Um, were you did that play at all into your, I don't know how you ended up at UC Merced, but did that play at all into your decision to study um at that department or under your particular advisor? You're working with Paul Smaldino, I believe, right
Yeah.
now. So I mean, feel free to talk about that if you'd like, but I was just curious if you're really thinking about this in terms of group dynamics, then you'd want to be putting yourself simultaneously in a network that's set up properly for
Hmm.
achieving the kind of innovation that you want to achieve. Assuming you want to achieve innovation, I mean, maybe you just want to exploit and you're going to go work in iBanking or
Yeah.
something. But like, depending on what your objective is, You want to like put yourself in a network that is amenable in terms of its contours to the
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing that you're going to be focusing on. The other thing to consider is that maybe you also want to be putting yourself into a position where you as an individual are going to be, let's say, optimally exploited for whatever kind of behavior that you yourself are
Yeah.
geared towards, right? So there's an assumption that some individuals would be better at doing one or more specialized at one variant of at one level of gradient of the task, whether it's exploit or explore. And so if you're a very high exploring individual, maybe you're very high on openness or something like that, maybe you'd want to think about positioning yourself into a place where you get to do a lot of that. Whereas if you're a person who's more geared towards just, um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't want to make it sound rote, but doing the same thing over and over again and getting very good at that thing, then you'd want to be putting yourself into a position where you have the opportunity to do that. And so there are many levels in which you can think about um, your own positioning, right?
Yeah.
In terms of taking advantage of these dynamics.
Yeah, totally. That was yeah, so UC Merced, I guess I'll just kind of give you a background on the place. It's actually in the United States, like the first research university founded in the 21st century. It opened in like 2006 was when its doors first opened. And essentially something weird has happened here, which is because it's such a new university, it has no path dependency in terms of its structuring. So, you know, all these people came in and they're like, all right, I'm going to make a cognitive science department, but it's going to be weird and it's going to be like embodied cognition and complex systems and all this other weird stuff that no one else is working on. We can now afford to kind of coax these people who are on the periphery and just, you know, make them a thing here. The same thing happened with our political science group. Like that place, poli sci here is like super into, you know, like psychological political science, and we have like a management school that's also like all complex systems. And so it's this kind of weird place where they were specifically able to coax very innovative groups, um,
Mhm.
you know, people kind of on the fringes of what you might call, you know, traditional fields that are quite entrenched, and build something new with them. And so so that is like specifically what kind of attracted me here, was looking into the departments and the interaction rates. I was like, look, it looks like people are just working on whatever they want to and kind of openly collaborating with each other. And yeah,
I'd like
so
to
you
do that.
it's nice, man. And so you mentioned like my departmental network. It's on my website,
Yeah.
culturologies.co. In terms of, because I've done a lot of networks now and collective problem solving tests, I still haven't found one that beats that one for its size. Just something about kind of the core peripheryness that we have in our network. You know, it tends to blow other ones out of the water. I think I had a preprint where I plotted the performance of all these different hypothetical networks, and then I plotted where, you know, UC Merced cognitive science was, and it was total outlier in terms of its performance. Um, so yeah, maybe this place is just specifically a very innovative place, but like you said, um, you know, it really depends on kind of what your psychological profile is. Like I tend to be very explore minded. Um, you know, I forget gosh, I forget what Razib called me once, but I think he called me like a dilettante or something. Because, you know,
Mhm.
I tend to read things very much on a surface level and be like, okay, well, I'm going to work on this for a little bit and then go work on something else. And a lot of traditional academic departments that really won't survive. So, for example, I was in an anthropology department before, and I was just absolutely miserable because the expectation was that you had to work on a specific system. That was all you're going to do. You know, you'd specialize on a specific primate and work on that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I think this idea that you just keep repeating the same thing over and over is really good for science, but it just wasn't for me.
Yeah, I believe your advisor calls himself a promiscuous scientist.
Yeah,
Paradigmatically promiscuous scientist. That's the term.
yeah, exactly. And so seeing kind of, you know, the way that he was able to interact with the world of science, I was like, okay, I'll go work with this guy because it seems like that's a good kind of character to model.
Yeah, I mean, well, so that's really amazing, and I'm really glad to hear that you know got your footing in at UC Merced. And I'm really excited for the work that you're doing. Um, it's yeah, it's incredible stuff. I mean, really, I can't overstate how important I think this stuff is. And I'm just like sort of wondering for you personally, like what's driving the you know the uh, the interest in all of these things, because I think if someone was to take a passing look at your biography, and there's a lot of information if you guys
Hmm.
want to learn more about Cody and his background on culturologies.co. That's his personal site. You can go there and get all the links to everything that he's been up to. um I think a lot of people might be unclear what to make of it, but to me, and I just have an intuition about this. Obviously, we've known each other for several
Hmm.
years now, and we've spent a lot of time talking. But I get the sense that all of the stuff that you're doing does have some sort of coherence to it. And I'm not saying that it's some sort of like master plan that you've got. Maybe there is. Um, but I get the sense that what you're doing is motivated by something much larger in terms of your vision for what you can bring to the world. And I was just curious if there was anything you wanted to articulate about the work that you're doing and how it kind of all fits together.
Yeah, sure. So, back when I was a primatologist, yeah, I was very much interested in cultural anthropology and just social theory in general. My background in cultural evolution is not, the modern conception of the field, which starts in like the 1970s with Luca Cavalli-Sforza and Marcus Feldman and Boyd and Richardson, but a much older one. Um, Coming from the neo-evolutionist anthropologist Leslie White in the 1940s, who talked a great deal about cultural complexity and how things get the way they are. Uh, Primarily, what I'm interested in is just adaptation as a principle and how we can kind of use that to guide ideal arrangements in the real world. When I was outside of primatology, I went to DC and I worked in Washington, DC for like a year or two. And, during all these internships, I was working on questions like welfare and poverty and ideal transportation networks, et cetera, et cetera. But kind of the most interesting period was when I had a Charles Koch Institute internship. And so when you're in this kind of CKI, they call it like the Koch internship program, they really try to brainwash you into what is Charles Koch's mindset. And it didn't really take much for me to realize like I was thinking about some of the same problems they were. The guy's a billionaire. And what are billionaires kind of obsessed with these days, or probably since time beginning? It's this concept of immortality. But
Mm,
this is a guy who realized early on he wasn't going to achieve biological immortality. So he started looking into the immortality of institutions. This is like Sam Oberge's whole thing. Like, how do I get an immortal society, et cetera, et cetera. There's really
mm,
this big drive to try and find this. And I'm kind of motivated by that question as well, but also the realization that maybe there just like isn't like an ideal arrangement for society, and maybe that kind of death is a good thing. Um, so if I had some kind of big plan, I tend to see myself working on the level of ideas and their adaptation. So how can I find like a sustainable philosophical system? How can we protect that kind of philosophical system? What are some boundaries that we have to put in place, or some structural arrangements that we have to deal with to identify when our philosophy or our epistemology is healthy? When does it look unhealthy? How do we know? A big question is, how do you recognize that you're just sitting at a local optima and that things could be better? I
mm,
think that trying to develop some kind of social toolkit for finding that out is going to be a big challenge for the 21st century. But, we have a set of tools that I think mean that at some point it's going to be within our reach. But the answers might not be that satisfying. It might be something like the work of Friedrich Hayek, where he basically said, you can design the rules of a soccer game, but you really better not try and figure out how the game's going to be played. It may be as simple as that.
Yeah, maybe. And you know, on this part about the mortality of institutions, I think this is something that was not really lost. I apologize for the digression, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't really lost on our founding fathers either.
Yeah.
When they were setting up the United States, they thought very hard about this question of how do you make a let's just say a regime
Mm-hmm.
that will last as long as possible. And their conclusion was sort of that you need some kind of meta system,
Yep.
some not a singular institution, but a system of institutions that has a mechanism for self renewal.
Yep.
And that's sort of how they, decided upon a constitutional republic. At the time, the sort of best conception of a system that they had available, and actually a very new one. Um, and yeah, that's just something. I mean, it may just be a vanity project, to be honest. To try to think that you can make something that lasts forever. And I don't even think I think even if you go up one more layer of abstraction to a meta system, you run into the same problem, right? It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
a turtles all the way down kind of phenomenon where you're just whatever thing you design is just not going to live forever, right? And
Yeah.
maybe you can create something that has a little bit of self renewal, but eventually things decay, things get corrupted, entropy works its way through the system, and everything dies. So
Yeah. I mean, this
uh,
is this is kind of at the core of my research, is that it seems like the real critical problem is path dependency.
mhm,
Just, once the system builds up some level of historicity, and it's simply, repeating what it knows, and it's not able to adapt in a new environment, that's when it begins to die. And there's been like a lot of, large studies on organizations and kind of what permits their longevity. And ironically, the number one factor seems to be CEO death. Not literal death, but the CEO exit,
yeah,
but
watch out,
having some
Elon.
kind of, yeah, right, having some kind of purposeful, renewal rate
Mhm,
does a lot for an organization. This is actually how the Coke organization is structured. They have like these like 7 guiding principles, and like every 7 years or so, they look at these principles and say, should they be adjusted or changed?
right.
Which is, kind of creepy. And I think about this like with the United States, that we had this amazing toolkit, which I think is natural law. Natural law was like the coolest thing we ever had. Um, but over time, the legal system ended up corrupting it. And so, you go to Europe and you see how well, kind of, you see how things are working. Maybe you can say whether or not it's better. But one of the things that you realize is that like Europe had the ability to like continually renew itself after every single war. If something wouldn't work, it would break down. Okay, time for a new country. All the
Mhm,
time people say, oh, the United States, it's so new. No, compared to pretty much every other country in the world, the United States is like substantially older. And we don't think about the amount of bloat that it's just built up over that time. If there's a simple way just to get a clean slate and then start, renewing again, it would be amazing. What would a system like that look like? I think about like um Heinlein, his book "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress." He kind of came up with a governance system where you had one legislative body that creates laws, and then one that decides whether to keep them over time.
mhm,
I think sometimes about just the way that like the Habsburg Empire worked, where you had kind of an emperor on top, this kind of noble class in the middle, and then this kind of non-landowning class on the bottom. But where the emperor was closer to this bottom class than it was to the middle class. And so there was this kind of natural system of checks and balances that didn't have to be explicitly written into the law, that allowed it to kind of, continue into the future.
yeah. There's also a problem, and this is particularly acute in the United States at the moment. which is that, there's a problem of demography, which is that if you don't have
Hmm.
good demographic turnover,
Yeah.
then you also aren't getting any proper renewal of these systems. And I think
Hmm.
that's a tough issue that we're facing right now. We just have a lot of old people, and bless their hearts, but they're occupying positions of authority, and not really allowing the system to renew itself
Yeah.
properly. And the longer people continue to extend their lifespans and have working lives, the more we run into this problem of, like, we're gonna have to evolve some sort of cultural norms around, honestly, getting these people out
Yeah.
of existing systems, because I don't know how else to solve it. Or mandatory retirement ages. I mean, you could do something like that, but yeah, that's like a big problem that I think uh, we have to solve if we actually want the US to be able to innovate going forward.
Yeah. The
I mean,
stickiness is real bad. Um,
the only places in the economy where there are a lot of innovation has basically been, yeah, the places that have very little path dependency, right?
yeah.
Tech, information technology. Why? Because it's new.
Yeah.
It's literally that. It's just because it's new. It has less craft built up over time. I mean, people blame regulations. I don't know to what extent, but regulations itself is also just another form of path dependency. So
Yeah.
I think path dependency is the more general problem, and um, that's something to that we should all be thinking about in terms of solving our own innovation issues. So it's actually quite good that we managed to make it over to the United States, because I wanted to also mention, um, within this conversation, a recent piece you wrote about internet polarization
Yeah,
and
sure.
Section 230. You wrote this. This is not a paper. You wrote this on your blog. Um, Basically, looking at the problem of Section 230. I actually have a piece on Section 230 that I wrote in undergrad a few years ago, that was related to 2016 election interference allegations, and
Hmm.
whether the free speech on the internet was going to get regulated as a result. Um, but basically, you were assessing in this piece the issue of polarization and internet polarization in particular.
Hmm.
And what I found curious about it was that you say you came to a very similar conclusion to myself and a number of other people that I've spoken to about this. So, for those listening, my previous podcast, the Agora Politics Show, which Cody was actually the first guest on, and then later came on again a second time, was originally designed to, or at least intended to, deal with the problem of political polarization. And
Hmm.
one of the reasons why I stopped the show, and why we're starting this new one, is that I realized at a certain point that political polarization, in the way that I was thinking about it originally, was not the actual problem that I thought it was. And
Mm.
I feel like you, in this piece, touched on some of the reasons why. And so, um, I wanted to just make sure to bring that up so that we could talk a little bit about how you're conceptualizing polarization and the way that the internet is polarizing people, um, and maybe how it could be polarizing people differently.
Yeah.
So please, if you could just talk a little bit about what your thoughts were from when you wrote this piece.
Yeah, so I wrote that piece, and then I also had a magazine article in the Hungarian conservative titled "The Ties That Bind Us" that kind of get into some of these themes as well. Something I've been getting into lately is the concept of digital governance, digital health. You know, how should the internet be structured in a way to make our epistemic systems stronger? So, in the piece that you're referring to, I was trying to think about this concept of weak ties is driving polarization. And essentially, what this means is that, let's say you're scrolling Facebook, you don't get polarized by the discussions that you're having or necessarily by people who agree with you. What you're polarized by, it seems, this research is kind of contested, but what it seems that what you're polarized by is exposure to the other side. And so what's happening is basically, you're seeing something from, I don't know, someone you went to college with, someone whose political opinion in no real world sense should you actually care about. But you're seeing this pop up on Facebook all the time, and it's kind of grossing you out. It's icking you out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a natural consequence of the way that a lot of our social networks are structured, and it's a problem, as far as I can tell, that's getting worse. One of the things that keeps a lot of social media relevant is the idea of common information. The idea that when I log onto Twitter, people are all talking about the same thing. That we all saw yesterday's Super Bowl ads, or we all saw the same movie, something that kind of builds this togetherness or this communitas to bring people together. I mean, Zuckerberg literally says his whole point of creating Facebook was to bring people together. I think when Facebook was founded, the path length between you and the furthest person from you in the network, which means how many people do you have to go through to get to that furthest person, was 8. Now it's like less than 3. So the furthest person in the world from you on Facebook is less than 3 people away, which is completely staggering to think about. And so I kind of had the mindset that the way that we've been thinking about polarization might be wrong, and that the best way of getting rid of polarization is, ironically, by increasing it. And so this idea of not just hyperpolarization, but hyperpolarization. Create more echo chambers, make sure that people are exposed to less novel information, lock people up into these groups, let them, debate into their nonsense, screaming into the void with one another, and see what happens. And the idea here is that what you'll get is that the polarization will happen more naturally in these groups. But instead of being polarized over just a few things, people are going to come to be polarized about a large number of things. That the space of disagreements, the number of items over which we disagree, will increase. So there was this paper by Flocka and Macy in 2011, where they created this kind of connected caveman network that I was telling you about, where the clicks are all connected. But what they did was they made some long-range ties. So, across this ring of networks, they would connect, this diagonal and this diagonal, so that really far away groups were then connected. Well, this increased polarization for obvious reasons, is that it kind of entrenched people in the beliefs of their group being exposed to someone who is, literally all the way across in topic space from them. But what they found is that when you increase the number of topics by which these individuals disagreed on, the polarization, as they were defining it, decreased. Now, why was that? So my advisor and his student, Matt Turner, did a reanalysis of that, looking at, what this kind of item increase effect was. And what it was actually like a hyper increase in polarization, that instead of people, disagreeing on this kind of, linear space, is that you had this like n-dimensional hypercube, and people were so polarized they were running into the corners. So instead of someone being like, oh, I'm polarized because I'm white and you're black, it's like, no, I'm polarized because I'm Italian, and specifically I'm from Genoa.
It reminds me, there's this so I'm obviously involved in a lot of like weird Twitter subcultures, and I sample quite widely, I like to think, and it reminds me, there's this disagreement within like certain like very niche subcultures on Twitter about whether you should be drinking large or small coffees. And like there's like a large coffee tribe. It's less alive now, the debate, but for a while there was like a large coffee tribe and like a small coffee tribe, and they were like vehemently, counter signaling each other, like you should be drinking small coffees, or you should be, and it's just it's an example of like this hyper polarization that you're talking about, where there's intense disagreement on something that's seemingly trivial, a matter of like preference or identification. but is actually in some ways a lot healthier than
Yep.
this very bimodal thing where it's like red versus blue or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and so I guess I just want to make sure that like people are getting a good idea of like graphically what this kind of like intensive polarization
Hmm.
that you're talking about looks like and how it's sort of qualitatively different than the way that we would normally use the term
Yep.
polarization. Um, one of the conclusions that I came to, I mean, the n-dimensional hypercube is like, yeah, a good way of saying it. But one of the conclusions that I came to was that um, it wasn't about bringing people closer to the center, and that actually what I wanted was
Hmm.
more innovation space
Yeah.
um, in
Yeah.
politics and culture. And the way to get that was to, uh, yeah, as you say in the piece, you have like this this very this ironic Mao quote about letting a thousand flowers
Yeah.
bloom. That
Yeah.
has some dark connotations, but basically, like you want proliferation of many different like fringe ideologies, basically,
Yeah.
was the conclusion that I came to. And so when people are like asking me, like, why are you, talking to these people, or why are you spending time on Twitter, like interacting with this weird subculture, it's like I think that we're actually fundamentally like very stuck,
Yeah.
and bringing more people into the center, bringing more people into the status quo is not how we're going to get unstuck. We need actually like a proliferation of all kinds of weird stuff. And
Yeah.
then though that weird stuff, like it's just like the core periphery dynamic. Some of that weird stuff, it's going to make its way back into the core,
Yep.
and it's going to get absorbed, and then we can actually get real change.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a very long-winded way of putting it, but that's sort of how I'm envisioning this, and that's sort of why I wanted to make sure that we touched on that point. Um, I have some quotes from this piece that I pulled out, and the link for this is going to be in the show notes. Um, you said what the internet has done is exposed us to more information but fewer ideas,
Yeah.
and I think that's fundamentally the issue, right? You're getting the same memes, the same triggering stuff on your timeline over and over and over again. And what you're not getting, unless you really make an effort to do so, is like actually genuinely new stuff. Like,
Hmm.
you know, I have a friend who's always like talking about how there's no, what he craves is new content, right?
Yeah.
And it's that issue. Um, so for an individual browsing online, I think also the whole length of our discussion so far could be useful for thinking about how you kind of sample
Yeah.
from the network, right? And that maybe for you yourself, let's just use your Twitter feed as a good example. Maybe you want to be setting up yourself as this kind of intermediary between the core and the periphery, where you're following a certain number of, like, let's say core affiliated
Hmm.
persons or institutions, and you're also making an effort to stay attached to elements on the periphery. This
Yeah.
is sort of why I never bias myself in favor of large accounts versus small accounts. If anything, I'm
Right.
more
Yeah.
biased with small accounts, because it's like, look, where am I going to find new interesting stuff? Probably not from a 50,000 follower account, right? Even
Yeah.
though that account has lots of social proof and there might be other reasons I want to follow them. Um, I want to be sampling from the outskirts of the periphery, because that's where I'm going to find the interesting stuff that's happening.
Exactly.
Um, and so that's sort of how I think about just curating my own feed. The other thing I do is that I tend to be very biased against institutions. So I do follow some institutions, but like every once in a while I go through my follows and I prune. I basically do a giant follow purge so that I can bring my follow count down. And one of the things that I like do almost automatically when I do that is like any institution, if
Yeah.
I don't have like a very strong attachment, like, you're talking about weak and strong ties. If I don't have a very strong attachment to that institution, automatically it's an unfollow. Like I'm much
Yeah.
more interested in following individuals and institutions, because I feel like there's a very similar dynamic in terms of an institution is generally constrained in a way that an individual is not. So even an individual that's tightly tied into the core has some novelty to them just by virtue of them being an individual.
Yeah.
That an institution is not really allowed. It doesn't have the same uh I guess degrees of freedom that most people do. It's very hard to keep an institution that limber.
Yeah.
Um okay, so those are just sort of my thoughts on how you might sample some of this stuff. Um I guess I want to just transition into sort of like what you're continuing to work on, what you're excited
Hmm.
about, and maybe if there's something upcoming that we should know about. Um, so what are you working on right now, and what are you excited about working on in the near future?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm working on some pretty fun things right now. So, I've been doing a lot in this collective problem solving space. I'm starting to move a little bit more into just specific facets of these network structures, specifically like the core periphery stuff. How do core periphery dynamics, influence things like polarization or take away from that. Um, with another professor in this department, Tyler Margettis, I'm doing some things on philosophical networks through time. So looking at using a model from physics called the Ising model to look at the health of philosophical debates, let's say in like, I don't know, third century Byzantium and Schopenhauer's Germany, et cetera, et cetera. There are networks of these things that people have built. Now we can kind of sit down and look and figure out what was happening that maybe made some of these periods, if they were philosophically productive, good, or if they were philosophically non-productive, bad.
I have a question for you about that.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm guessing that these networks are primarily put together due to like citations or
Yeah,
references.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So um you could do some like delineation of like schools of thought
Yeah,
basically by looking at the connectedness of these networks. I'm actually very interested in this.
yeah,
Yeah, if you could send me some stuff on that actually afterwards.
yeah,
Uh
totally.
I
Sure.
want to look at that because there's something I'm working on right now that's uh that could potentially be putting together curricula based on something like this. Um okay, so sorry about that.
No,
Continue.
cool, for sure, for sure. Yeah, and then recently I was with my advisor. This is kind of the conclusion of a grant that kind of funded me in the last year, working on this concept of information architectures. So actually formally entering this discussion about, say, the structure of the internet or systems of propaganda or just information dispersal um, in societies. I mean, it's this is kind of the big thing that keeps me up now is how is it that we should be restructuring the internet? How is it that we need to be thinking more seriously about our recommendation algorithms and what is it that they're doing? Why is it that Reddit killed the comic book guy? Why do Marvel movies all cater to normies now? Those are very serious questions. I really do think they
Mhm.
are. And they might actually have very, very simple answers, which is just that we've sped up, our information consumption rate and our exposure to as many people as possible. That now, we don't get as much novelty.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on this just um distill this point a little bit more clearly
Yeah,
because it's something that I've thought about and I've tried writing about it, but I don't think I have a great grasp on how to express it properly. Um Basically like what you're saying is that the internet has had like a counterintuitive homogenizing effect
yeah,
on certain aspects of culture. Which you would not expect. You would think that, oh, you connect the world and then suddenly there's just a Cambrian explosion of new ideas and
yeah,
new thought and new fashion and all this other stuff. And it turns out there's like, um, maybe it's because of renormalization. Maybe it's because actually we're just all not that interesting and we just converge on the same stuff.
hmm,
I don't know what it is, but um, this problem of the internet being a homogenizer, you're saying might be due to the structure of the networks that we've set up itself.
yeah, exactly, exactly. It's also the reason why, we eat very important information now, like popcorn. I mean, people are getting crushed in South Korea in these, parties or whatever happening in the streets. And then like the next day we're talking about Will Smith, you know, slapping Chris Rock or whatever. Like it's just preposterous to me, the rate at which information has increased. And this is definitely connected to this explore exploit trade-off, that our networks right now are totally geared for exploitation, but not geared at all for exploration. We have these great centralizers now that are acting as giant centrifuges, just sucking all the air out of the corners of the room, so that nothing can proliferate there. And I'd like to see, in the same sense, there's a lot of things that we see like in the physical world that I think haven't yet manifest in the digital world. So this idea of intentional spaces is not something that we see yet, or like a seriousness of community that people form online, and in terms of like policing its boundaries is not something that we really sense as much. I mean, we sense it when we see like the emergence of like right-wing hate groups or something like that, but that's just seeing the internet as sort of a tool for a real world ecology rather than a very rich ecology of its own, that will produce very unique human dynamics. So this is something I've gotten interested in recently, is to what extent have our governance systems not caught up with the fact that we are no longer simply just embodied agents, but agents that are pretty much limitless through the means of the internet. There's nothing stopping, aside from some material constraints, my grandchildren's children's children hearing me talk about this right now. We haven't really figured out a way of dealing with that, and maybe we can say, oh, there's books, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the way that we express agency and we allow agency to be a thing online is not only going to be as real as it is in the real world, but even more real. I was thinking about this recently, the fact that to go and get a haircut in certain places, you have to log in somewhere else and do it online, and you can pay ahead, et cetera, showing that the real inconvenience to your life is not scheduling and getting a haircut. It's the physical act of getting your hair cut, that we've already offloaded so much into our corporeal spaces. We need to very seriously think about how we're going to take that seriously in the future, especially with the rise of, let's say, we accidentally start creating agents that purely exist in these spaces. We have to have this set up beforehand with the realization that a lot of those dynamics are already being played out by us online right now.
And so I guess when I think about the lack of, it seems to me like there's an analogy between the physical world that you can draw with the internet and a kind of way in which the internet has not been able to replicate the same spatial representation that we have in real life. And I guess one point contra to that would be that I do see this happening in very small ways, but it does seem as if the core is antagonistic to these kinds of developments, right? So you have like issues like Twitter blocking certain links or not wanting people to go off the platform for various reasons. And really what you're saying is that like there should be more spaces that are I don't want to say parasitizing, but that are getting people offloaded from the core and out into, like you said, intentional spaces, whether these are, private chat rooms, study groups, Discord servers, whatever you want to do, Urbit. I mean, I don't care. But like there is a way in which I see this happening, but it's happening very slowly. And I think one of the troubles with this is also finding the right way to, like, when you talk about policing boundaries and having a sense of, like, let's say initiation or exclusion from certain groups. Um, these are things that are fundamental to maintaining like uh highly affiliated groups in the real world,
Yeah.
but seem to be anathema to a lot of the ideologies that are perpetrating online right now. Nobody wants
Hmm.
to think of themselves as exclusive, or if they do, it's only in some trivial sense on the basis of like, willingness to pay or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas probably what we need is some sort of way to both like inculcate more of these kinds of dynamics, as well as like use the core in a way to kind of aggregate them. Like I was
Yeah.
talking to a friend the other day, and he was saying that the problem with decentralization is that in some ways you need more centralization because you need some sort of mass aggregator
Yep.
of all the decentralized groups that you could be joining. Like you don't know what they are. How do you find them?
Yep.
Right now, you just have to kind of know the right people. They send you the right invite code. They tell you about something. Um, but maybe there could be, alternative protocols or something like that. Where, you could see a list of things that you could join, you could apply to join them, only certain conditions, would have to be met for you to get invited, something like that. I could imagine
Yeah.
um some sort of central marketplace for let's say niche social media or something. I don't know. But
Yeah. Yeah. This
trying to
is
change
this.
the topography of our internet landscape is sort of
Yeah.
what we're getting at.
Yeah, this is kind of how I've thought about, something like and I'm not going to pretend I'm an internet guy, but something more sustainable for Facebook would be like if there were like multiple Facebooks when you got on Facebook and communities were opt-in. You know, this is kind of what I was getting at in the Section 230 thing. I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but we've clearly been deceived over what Section 230 is supposed to be. There's this idea that Facebook is not a publisher, but it's a distributor. But this is like saying when you go into Barnes and Noble, it says, all right, there you go, 28-year-old male, brown hair, white guy, dresses conservative. All right, you can only read the philosophy section. Like, well, how
Mm.
do I see the other books? And it's like, well, as you start reading more philosophy books, we'll start recommending you. That clearly seems like a curation role that they're taking on in the same sense that a publisher is, except for they're literally not publishing it. And so I almost have this vision where Facebook is an opt-in, opt-out system. You can either opt in to the great centralizer that it possesses, or you can opt out of that and opt into more bespoke networks. The bad thing is that maybe you won't see family posts as much, but then maybe you make a family network, right? But in some sense, I feel like we're looking at this, it would be computationally expensive, but I almost see money on the table in terms of advertising revenue. Once the system is opt in, you know, you're selling people stuff that they want to buy. I mean, this idea that, I join, say, like a flint napping group, and all I see is like, advertisements for rocks. I mean, I would be in my heart's content. But something like that currently doesn't exist. So I think we think about this in that it's not economic, but it might be that we're stuck at a local optima because it's expensive to maintain. The ecologist Martin Sheffer talks about this idea of efficiency traps, which is that once you start exploiting, you actually make the valleys deeper around you. We might be at that right now. I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, so much to think about there. I guess the YouTube recommendation algorithm is somewhat similar,
Yeah.
but the problem there is that again, the boundary conditions are entirely amorphous, right?
Yep.
You
Yep.
could go from watching, I don't know, you could go from watching like a cooking video on like Steak Tube
Yeah.
to watching some political commentary a few minutes later, depending on what you're following. I mean, probably that won't show up in your recommendation feed, but um it's you're not really opting in. It's sort of like
Yep.
a very passive, uh non-intentional way of getting you kind of get floated along through the YouTube river, right?
Yeah.
and then one day you're watching this interview. Okay. Well, thank you, Cody, for coming on the show. It was great to connect with you once again and talk about your work. Um, before we go, where can people find you? Where can people follow you to keep up to date with what you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So you can follow my website at culturologies.co. On there, there's a link to my Substack. There's a link to my Twitter. My Twitter handle is LTF_01. That's historically because I used to write under a pseudonym. Maybe I'll change it to Culturologies or something soon. But yeah, you can find all my stuff on there and see what all I'm working on. So
Great. Awesome. Thank you guys. And see you next time, Cody.
see it.